Let me begin. I want to tell a story that some of y'all have heard before. My wife and I met at Bible study fellowship in the young adult class maybe 25 years ago. We were both in leadership, and one of the teaching directors was a real close friend of mine. And she told me, "You need to meet this girl, Catherine. I think you'd like to go. Y'all would be a great couple." And I did, and I wasn't interested. I told her, she just has too much energy for me. I can't do that. So maybe about a year later, for some reason, she and I needed to, we ran an errand together, and we had to drive like an hour away and then come back. And I realized, Catherine is great. But she was dating a guy named Kyle. So I didn't do anything. I just sat on the sideline and thought, if something ever happens with them, I'm gonna make my move. And they did eventually break up. And before you knew it, I'm doing things like, hey, you want to take country western dance lessons together, or you want to go see a movie, or we're hanging out with friends. And eventually I realized I just need to be honest with her. And it was one night after a wedding, I told her, hey, the reason I'm spending all this time with you is that I want to date you. And her response, I'll never forget, because her response was one word over and over again: really? And it wasn't an excited really. It was a confused really. So every relationship has a story behind it. And tonight we're going to see the story of Ruth and Boaz. And this is a story that begins with 3 funerals and it ends with a wedding. And in it we see, don't get it? And in it we see that God was and still working, that God was and is still worthy of our trust. Even during troubled times and tragedies, we can still trust him. And that's the central idea tonight. God is worthy of our trust, even during the troubles and tragedies of life. God is worthy of our trust, even during the troubles and tragedy of our life. So the first division is chapter 1, and I titled it Setting the Stage, because it really, in these first 4 verses, it's setting the stage for what's about to unfold. We have an Israelite leaving his hometown of Bethlehem for Moab due to a famine. And this would have been about a 50-mile trip. And he and his family are hoping to find bread there, which is ironic because Bethlehem means house of bread. Get it? In Bethlehem, there is no food. So he takes his wife, his 2 sons, and over time, the sons marry Moabite women. But then over time, the 3 men die, leaving behind 3 widows. We can't miss this important point as we look at what this family did, because Elimelech, the husband, he never should have left Bethlehem. He never should have left the promised land to live with Israel's enemies, the Moabites. Leaving where God would have you only invites trouble, and that's what he did. That he left seems a little surprising, considering his family was more the exception in Israel than the rule, because remember, it talks about in Judges, in the book of Judges, people were generally doing whatever was right in their own eyes. But this family seems to have been different, because we see this family move to Moab, and they're living out their faith so much so that Ruth wanted what they had. She saw in them and their God something that drew her to them. After losing her husband and sons, Naomi heard the famine was over, hence decided to go home, back to Bethlehem. Her daughters-in-law were prepared to go with her, but 3 times she encouraged them to stay, expressing her belief that there was more hope for them in Moab than there was for those ladies in the promised land. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye and turned back. She wanted to be a wife again. But Ruth clung to Naomi. The word clung here is used in other places to refer to the closeness in a marriage. She was determined to stick with Naomi and with this kind of powerful bond. She wanted to be a daughter, not only a daughter to Naomi, but a daughter of Israel. We see this in one of the great declarations found in the Bible. And we see in this also a great leap of faith for Ruth. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the God do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And if you look at the text she refers to the Lord. It's capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, and that means that she's using the word Yahweh. She's referring to him as Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. So she's taking upon herself the covenant God of Israel as her own. Naomi probably hoped to show up in Bethlehem and nobody noticed, but that clearly wasn't the case because everyone did. The town was stirred up. They said, "Can this be Naomi?" This may reflect her appearance. It could reflect her poverty, maybe her circumstance, maybe all of the above. She and her Moabite daughter-in-law were the talk of the town. She made it known that she was bitter but not broken by saying, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." But the chapter ends with hope. The writer tells us they arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest. If I asked you whose quote this was, I doubt anyone in here could answer. The hotter the heat, the harder the steel. No pressure, no diamonds. If you were a Baylor football fan, you probably could, because that's Robert Griffin's quote when he accepted the Heisman Trophy. This quote reminds us that intense hardship has the potential to produce great results. In these cases, unusually hard steel or a beautiful diamond. Naomi and Ruth both found themselves under intense hardship following the deaths of their husbands. They needed a roof over their head. Just needed food to eat. They needed protection. They needed security. In their story, we see Naomi and Ruth choosing to respond differently. The circumstances for Ruth produced unusually hard steel, a beautiful diamond. For Naomi, the intense hardship produced some cracks and some flaws. Apparently, Naomi had been a light in her pagan Moab world. What she revealed about God and his people to Ruth captivated Ruth's heart and sealed her commitment. But that light seemed to have dimmed. This seems apparent when, by her words to Orpah and Ruth, she encouraged them to pursue marriage and children in Moab rather than exposing her life to God and his people. She encouraged them to return to their pagan families and God, which would lead to destruction, rather than follow her into fellowship with God's people and the Lord himself. As we see, Naomi's circumstances produce bitterness. On the other hand, we see Ruth's face blossom. In the God of Israel, Ruth sees hope. She sees life. She sees a future, even in the midst of uncertainty, hunger, and insecurity. And in order to be a part of this faith, she was willing to give up everything because she believed God was worthy. We need to be like Naomi in the best of times, by exemplifying the love of God to others, by possessing reverent fear of the Lord, and by pursuing personal holiness. And like Ruth in troubles and tragedy, we should see God is still worthy of our trust. Who or what do we immediately think of when troubles or even tragedy strike? Do we think of a person that we need, a resource that we need? Let my eyes turn to God, who is, whether we can understand or not, God's on the move. He's on his throne and he's doing things for his glory, and all the while not losing sight of you and me, whom he loves. God is worthy of our trust, even during the troubles and tragedy of life. The second division is chapter 2, and I just titled it, "The Boy Meets the Girl." When Ruth went into the fields to glean at the edges, neither she nor Naomi had any idea what the story that was about to unfold in her life and Naomi's. Verse 3 says, she went into the fields. She happened to go to the part of the field owned by Boaz. As we all know, this wasn't a coincidence. God brought her there because he was working. And here the writer tells us two important things about Boaz. And one, that he was a relative, so he could be a redeemer. And the other is that he was worthy. He was a worthy man, and this indicated that he was a man of standing due to his wealth. And the rest of the story displays that. When Boaz asks about Ruth's identity, he finds out she's Naomi's daughter-in-law and had been working nonstop all day. From there, his heart goes to work. Everything about her is impressive. Not only her work ethic, but word had spread how she loved and cared for her mother-in-law, and how she had left her country and her country's gods for Bethlehem and Naomi and his God. My mind's eye pictures Ruth as a young lady with a visible, undeniable strength and character, and a winning smile. Maybe Boaz didn't experience love at first sight, but reading this, it sounds like he must have had at least a little hidden crush on her. Whatever the case, she found favor in Boaz, and whatever was behind his favor at that moment turned into action. He told her to stay in his fields near his female servants under the protection of his male workers, both physically and verbally. They weren't to touch her. And notice it also says they were told not to embarrass her. So don't use any words that would embarrass her. She would be given first chance at the best of the gleanings and was able to eat and drink with the workers. And he personally fed her. So by publicly feeding her personally, he made it clear that she was under his protection. I'm sure she was at least a little fearful when she went out in the fields on that first day, speaking of Ruth. But when she headed back, she must have been so excited because she had been loaded down with barley, an estimated half a month's wages. And there she tells Naomi about her day. And if Naomi wasn't on the edge of her seat before she asked Ruth whose field she had been in, she must have jumped out when she realized that it was Boaz's field. This formerly bitter woman declares, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. The writer lets us know this went on for a while. Ruth kept working in the fields of Boaz through the barley and wheat harvest, and this would have lasted about 6 to 7 weeks. The Dead Sea Scrolls included 972 manuscripts discovered between 1946 and 1956. They included many extra biblical documents, including an interesting diary written about 1000 BC. Let me read a day out of that diary. "Dear diary, it's almost been 7 weeks since I saw her in my barley field for the first time. Of all the barley fields and all the towns and all the world, she walks into mine. I still haven't decided if it was really a good or bad thing. Unfortunately, now she's all I think about. Yesterday, when I was with the city elders discussing how to repair the gate, I realized everyone was just staring at me. Jedediah had asked me a question. I was dreaming about her big dark eyes. The workers in the field are ready for me to find somewhere else to supervise. I've been making too many trips to that field while the other fields are being neglected. Nothing sounds better to my ears than Hebrew spoken with a Moabite accent. I'm not really sure anymore how cute she is. I just know she's beautiful to me, which is what makes each day both bitter and sweet. I can tell she enjoys me, but I just feel like her big, overprotective brother. I can tell I'm not the only one who's noticed her. I'm not as young as the others. Those who are getting to know her are beginning to see what I see. And when she is ready to marry again, the line won't be short. That's what makes having seen her in my field for 7 straight weeks both bitter and sweet." That wasn't real. It's great for us as readers to know there's a Boaz, a redeemer, an answer, a resolution worth celebrating just around the corner for Ruth. But that's not life for us. We can't know, like Ruth didn't, what God has placed in someone's heart to be or to do for us. What position, what turn of events or person God has waiting for us. In the meantime, what can we do? And the story of Ruth offers us 3 things. And the first one is to be blessable. By that, I mean, be where God has called or will call you to be, doing the things that he would call you to do. Don't try to escape your problems. Don't try to just endure your problems. Get about God's work, like Ruth in the fields. She made herself blessable. Be blessable, and then look for appointments. God in his grace comes to our aid in his time, in his appointments. We can't create it ourselves. So be on the lookout for the people, the places, for the things God is bringing into your life, for the God-ordained appointments. Be on the lookout for ways he might be showing himself to you through the circumstances around you so that you might embrace and celebrate those. Be blessable, look for appointments, and finally, let your hope in God sustain you. This book and all of God's word shows us that even in the worst of times, like the Israelites in captivity in Egypt, like David on the run as an outlaw, like the disciples were brokenhearted and scattered after the crucifixion, there's life, good times that follow, whether in this life or the next. God is planning for the best of times, and you are in that plan. God is worthy of our trust, even during the troubles and tragedies of life. The last division of chapters 3 and 4, I titled it So and So Says No. That'll make sense in just a second. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi expressing her desire for Ruth to gain rest. And when Naomi says this, is always about long-term security. And that would come through marriage to Boaz, who she seems to feel very confident has an unspoken interest in Ruth. Maybe Naomi had seen the way Boaz had looked at Ruth. Maybe she had heard what other people were saying about what Boaz felt about Ruth. And remember, the harvests are coming to an end. So Naomi is realizing they're not going to see each other every day. So now's the time to act. Once that harvest is over, she's not going to be in his fields interacting with him. It's not going to be easy. So it's time for her to act. So Naomi, hoping or maybe assuming Boaz was the nearest kinsman redeemer, saw the time had come for Ruth to seize the initiative with Boaz. And the time was when he was sleeping with his grain in the threshing floor, and he would sleep on his grain because it had just been threshed, and now he's the owner and he's protecting it. So she was to do three things. She was to make herself attractive, and this included changing or putting on nicer clothes, and perhaps she'd been wearing clothes of mourning after her husband had died. She was to anoint herself. She was to be attractive and then be assertive by taking the covers off his feet. And finally, be available, do whatever he says. All this in a way that was honorable for both her and Boaz. One commentator suggested the name of the ointment or cologne she put on that night was Midnight in Moab. I got the biggest kick out of that because this particular commentator, and I say this in a very respectful way, always seemed very stuffy to me. So it's funny that he would come up with Midnight in Moab. The plan unfolded just as Naomi hoped and anticipated. By asking him to spread his wings over her, she is asking him to claim her in marriage. When he realizes Ruth is making herself available to marry, he's beside himself that she would choose him rather than one of the younger men. And based on his choice of words, it sounds like she would have had other options. There were other men that would have been interested. It also suggests he had basically written himself off due to his age. So Naomi would be certain of his intentions. He sent Ruth back early in the morning with probably as much grain as she could carry and instructions to wait. He assured Ruth he would resolve the issue before the day was over. This is something he'd probably been thinking about for a long time. If I was going to marry Ruth, how would it happen? Would she be interested? Would would I have her blessing? Would there be any customs or laws in the way? What about the potential redeemer? He understood that there was someone there. Now he knew Naomi would marry him, and he understood that Ruth would marry him, and Naomi would bless that. But the issue with the redeemer had to be resolved. Naomi was confident, though. She apparently knew men, or she at least knew Boaz, because she tells Ruth, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And she was right. Boaz wasted no time by going to the main gate, and this is where the business transactions took place. And the other potential redeemer, who had first rights at buying back Naomi's husband's land according to law, he came by. I thought it interesting that the writer shows his contempt for the man by calling him literally Mr. So-and-so in the original Hebrew, Mr. X or Mr. So-and-so. Another commentator makes fun of him by always referring to him as old what's-his-name, since his name isn't given. When Boaz saw the man, old what's-his-name, in the presence of 10 other witnesses, Boaz raises the issue of redeeming the land. And he was interested in doing that, but not if it included marrying Ruth. He said it would impair his inheritance. By this, he likely meant if they had a son, that son would end up being his sole heir, and his property and the property of Naomi's son, Mahlon, would all go to Elimelech's family and not down his line, not to old what's-his-name's family line. Once the man had refused, Boaz publicly declared his intention to buy Naomi's land as kinsman redeemer and take Ruth as his wife. Bethlehem seemed excited for Ruth, for Boaz, and I'm sure for Naomi in light of all that she had gone through. Not only did Naomi gain rest as well, she gained a grandson who she was able to raise like her own son as his nurse. That son, Obed, would be the grandfather of David. And another important element of this story is it shows the line of David goes all the way back to Judah, the line God had promised to raise a king through. One definition of an instrument is a device whereby something is achieved. Musicians use instruments to produce music. Doctors use instruments to practice medicine. Pilots use instruments to navigate aircraft. God uses instruments in our world today, and the devices he uses to achieve his purposes are people. People like Ruth, Boaz, Naomi, and you and me. If we, like them, if we hold fast to God, wait on him and his timing rather than taking things into our own hands. Each acted honorably before both God and man, and in the end, they received the desires of their hearts. They didn't run from their opportunities to do good things. They didn't run from their opportunities to be a blessing to others or to express their faith through their lives. And what was their result? What was their legacy in God's kingdom? They allowed themselves to become instruments in God's plan to provide Israel with a great earthly king and eventually an eternal one. God has plans for you and for your life, for me and mine, great ones with a great eternal legacy if we are faithful. Even during troubles and tragedies, God is worthy of our trust even during the troubles and tragedies of life. When I was in school, no one liked pop tests. I don't know that anyone does. You walk in, the teacher tells you pull out a piece of paper and a pen, and they ask you 5 or 10 questions to see what you should, to find out what you know about your studies. And life is filled with pop tests that reveal where we are in our lives, or maybe more accurately, those pop tests reveal what's in our hearts. How we respond provides the answer. These pop tests usually come daily, but there's also a kind that comes only a few times in your lives, as Naomi and Ruth found. May God find us faithful when circumstances hand us a pen and paper to see where we are. May God find us faithful because we have been actively preparing and training our hearts to trust and obey in both good and tragic times. Will you entrust your hopes and heartaches to God's wise plan? God is worthy of our trust, even during the troubles and tragedies of our lives. Let's pray. God, again, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this story. I pray that we would be encouraged by it. Thank you for the display of love that you show for just our daily lives. I ask that you bless this week. It's in your great name we pray. Amen. You're dismissed.